Our first storyteller is Mayra Pelagio, and Mayra is currently in her second year at San Jose State in the graduate program for environmental studies. And she plans to bring wildlife conservation education programs to underfunded communities and to Spanish-speaking communities. She's currently working as a community organizer for the Rapid Response Network of Santa Clara County to empower the immigrant community. She's also a higher education fellow at Immigrants Rising, focusing on undocumented youth. Now, there's parts of her story that are pretty emotional, and so I want you to really make her feel warm. And you're going to find that she is an incredible blend of strength, determination, and vulnerability. But she's the kind of environmentalist that we so desperately need. And I hope that one day that's what we recognize her for, and she doesn't need to just be the person representing those who need to not be deported.
Thank you, and thank you so much for the beautiful land introduction and land acknowledgement. I think that's really necessary for all of the public events that we have. It's good to acknowledge the land that we're stepping in. I do want to mention something. It was mentioned that immigrants bring a lot of economic growth, but that's not the only thing that we bring, so I'd like to point out that we bring so many other things, and I wouldn't want you all to live with the idea that the only thing we bring is economic growth. So my name is Mayra, and today I'll be sharing a little version of my story of how moving to San Jose has really helped me shape my identities in this journey, right? So from the time that I was 6 years old, I grew up in a small town in a rural side of Mexico, in Guanajuato, and the town was so small that it had about only less than 800 people. At this point, my sister, my brother, and myself had to move in with our grandma, while our mom worked in a city that was called Pénjamo, the bigger city. And she worked during the day at a Coca-Cola factory, and throughout the night she would work at a local bus station to be able to provide for the four of us. She was a single mom, so she really needed these two jobs to be able to afford a living out there, even if that meant that she would only see us once a week, right? And eventually, holding both jobs was not enough. So she had to embark in a journey to come to the United States and leave us behind. I lived in a little town that was called La Estrella, and many of the families there grew grains like corn and wheat. And many of the women worked for a big company making soccer balls. And this big company would come into the town and would drop off the materials for the women to work with by hand. And I remember the cuts in my grandma's hand, from the waxing of the string that she had to use to sew the seams. And I remember that I was really little and I would try to help her to just finish just one ball. And I would give up right away after waxing one string or two, because it was a really tough labor, and it was poorly paid, and it really took advantage of the community. And when it was time, I attended middle school in La Laguna, which was a different town. And I would wake up before the sun to make it to the bus pickup at 5:45 a.m. And since my town was the last stop, by the time that I got in, it was packed with the kids from all over the other villages. We were all packed like sardines, and we were all just waiting to make it to school, just hoping that we would get a break from the household chores that we had to do. My grandma was really young, and she had two other children that were similar in age to myself. And so she had expected me to be responsible for my two siblings. By the time that I was 12, I started to feel really sad about the life that I had there, given that all of my peers were dropping out of school to help their families farm. And I didn't see any apparent reason or any apparent way for me to pursue a career or a job in La Estrella. And by that time, our mom had been away for 4 years. By the time, my mom, on the other hand, was working tirelessly. And by the time that I was 13, she finally gathered enough money to bring us here with her. She took a risk, and she came back over the border to get us. And the encounter that we had with her was very emotional, because after all, we hadn't seen her for 5 years, and my little brother had only been 1 year old when she had left. Our journey to the US was anything but easy. And after 10 days of driving, walking, and running, we made it to a place that my mom called home in San Jose, just in time to enjoy the last hours of Christmas Day. Everything about San Jose was much different from La Estrella. And what I liked the best was that we had access to hot water for showering, because in La Estrella, we didn't have water. And when we did, we would warm it up by keeping it out in the sun, and just hope that by the end of the day, we would have like warm water for a hot bath. But that never worked. It was like a mind trick that our grandma put on us. So when I arrived to San Jose, because I didn't speak any English, I was placed in low-level ELD classes, but I was determined to move on to these more advanced courses. And the first class that I took was environmental science, AP environmental science. And it was a class that I loved because it encompassed everything that I cared about, and it was really the thread that linked my life back in Mexico to my new community here in San Jose. My community in Mexico had no paved roads, and the dirt paths were so uneven that when it rained, they became the size of like small pools. And here we make plans to go outdoors or to go hiking over the weekend. And in Mexico, the great outdoors, as we know it here, was basically our community. Anything outside the four walls that we lived in, that was home. Thinking of this reminds me of the caminatas that I had with my great-grandma, Mama Mayra. She was the one who taught me everything. At her old age, she's the strongest woman that I know. She must have been in her 70s when she took me out with her in her caminatas to small villages. And I remember that she would wake up with the sun, and she had a lot of birds, so she would wake up and she would feed the birds. And as she was doing this, she'd start singing to them, and she'd ask them to sing back to her. Thank you. She would feed her cats and dogs, and she would water her plants. And only after this, we would be on our way to a plaza where we took the bus, to different villages. There's this one village that I remember the most. It was called Ojo de Agua, which is Eye of Water. In this town, the streets were really intertwined with a slow-flowing river, and the river was fed by these small springs that came out throughout the town. And my great-grandma, Mama Mayra, she was raised Catholic. She would always tell me that it was the earth crying for our sins. It was the earth crying for us. And despite all of that, it was a beautiful scenery, and I just remember enjoying so much being outdoors with her. And she taught me a lot of things. She would constantly say things like, you should be really grateful and how blessed we are to just be able to enjoy all this natural beauty. And with really great patience, that's how she taught me that we needed to care for our environment. Whether it's a person or a mosquito, she really helped me see the value that everything has in this world. So, it makes me really sad to think, she's now in her 90s. It makes me really sad to think that I might not be able to see her again, so that's why I get really emotional when I think about this. When I was a senior in high school, I was accepted to UC Davis and 5 other colleges. And the first thing my mom said was, no, we cannot afford for you to go to college. How dare you? But she was not referring to the cost of college. She also meant that we couldn't afford to lose my support or the support that I was to provide to the family. I was the oldest of 5 by that time, and it was really hard. As an older sister, I was expected to stay home and to provide support, taking care of the children, or providing to the income of our household. Regardless of this, I worked diligently, and by the time that I was going to start college, I had about $8,000 in scholarships, and I was ready to go to college. But my family still felt a sense of betrayal, and it felt almost like if I was abandoning them. And it was a feeling that I had to bear with for the 5 years that I spent completing my degree. I attended UC Davis and majored in environmental science and management with a minor in wildlife conservation biology. It's a mouthful. So I always regret having to say that. But unfortunately, or as it is in every higher education space, I was often the only Latina in my classes, and it was a really difficult space to navigate, as I constantly felt like I was an imposter. The last quarters in Davis were the most difficult ones. It was 2017, right after the election. And it was really hard being in the spaces where, in my wildlife conservation classes, Many of my peers were hunters and came from family of hunters, and they had really conservative backgrounds, and they were pro-gun and anti-immigrant. And I remember in a lot of my classes seeing some of them wearing Make America Great Again hats, and even Confederate flags in their clothing. And I remember being really afraid and really fearful to go to classes with them or field trips, because it almost felt like the entirety of my existence was under threat. So fortunately, I had a community that I could rely on in Davis. They have an undocumented student support group in which students provide help to one another as they navigate this really difficult space that is higher education. I tried to stay positive about pursuing my degree and graduating, but because there was no way for me to work, I decided to stay an extra quarter, hoping that by the end of it all, there would be an immigration relief for myself. Unfortunately, there wasn't any. I became an independent contractor, which was really good too. In 2017, I went with a delegation of undocumented students and allies to Washington, D.C. to advocate for the Federal Dream Act. This was about the 5th time that Congress was trying to pass the Federal Dream Act. And it was a really impactful experience for me. It was a life-changing experience, getting to meet Congress people from all over the country. And it was even more impactful having one of them look me right in the eye and tell me, "You do not belong here. I do not like to support illegal actions." Even with some rejection, this experience only strengthened my courage as an advocate, and it was really one of the most crucial experiences that shaped my identity. So who am I? I am a young Latina woman who came from a small rural town in Guanajuato to academic life in urban America, looking for a better life. I am passionate about the environment. I dream of creating projects to increase environmental awareness and accessibility to the outdoors for all of the Latinx communities across the US. I have moved on from the limitations of my status, and in the process, I have learned to embrace all of my identities. I am a descendant of powerful women. I am a sister, a scholar, an entrepreneur, an advocate, and at the end of it all, I am a badass brown woman who is and will continue to fight for social and environmental change. Thank you.